for all of the traditions in the sort of Abrahamic group of religions, that's to say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of those religions go back to one single idea of the beginning. And that we can find, of course, in the book of Genesis at the beginning of the Bible, right? And even though we might think of the Bible as being particularly Jewish or particularly Christian, as we sort of grow up in our own lives, in fact, the Genesis story fits underneath all three of the great Abrahamic traditions. And it's a really cool story because it gives us a way to understand how those huge traditions, right, which are most of the human beings who live on the earth now, follow one of those three traditions. It gives us an idea of how time works, how time started, and the structure of time for all three of those Abrahamic traditions. So let's go back. Most of you will know this, but let's think about it again. Genesis begins with the words, in the beginning. Seems easy enough. In the beginning. Makes perfect sense. But it's important, right? Because this is saying that there is a finite time when time begins. Before, in the beginning, there may have been stuff there, God say, maybe water, maybe chaos, but from the beginning we see something that actually starts. So then Genesis says, okay, what happens? Day one, God makes light and dark. Good. Day two, God makes the firmament, or what we might call air or heaven. Happy with that? He goes on to day three. In day three, God makes the land, which is to say earth, and plants with seeds and fruit. And when you were reading through Genesis, you undoubtedly noticed that this is said over and over and over again, that these were plants with seeds and fruit. And that's important because it means that they can reproduce themselves without any help from anybody else. Day three, land, plants with seeds and fruit. Day four, you might not expect it, but it comes kind of late. The sun, the moon, and the stars. And you'll remember that the Genesis text says, so that they would know day and night. So that's pretty wild, right? Because we had light and dark earlier, now we have sun, moon, and stars, but not until day four. Day five, my personal favorite day, is the day when you get all of the fishies, right? You get fish, you get sea monsters, you get mammals, you get all of the cool stuff that lives in the water. Day six is life on land. So your bugs and your animals and your human beings. That's very important, right? That in the sixth day, God made all of the animals that lived on the earth, and God made human beings. And when you're reading Genesis, the text says something like that God made humans in our image and likeness. So there's this idea that human beings would be somehow more like God than, say, sea urchins would be, something like that. So we have human beings a little bit different than the other creations on day six. But imagine what this is telling us, that there is a finite beginning to time and that things are happening in some sort of chronological order, right? So Aristotle would have loved this. And in fact, many of the great philosophers in Judaism and in Islam and in Christianity understood Genesis through the lens of Aristotle because they saw this as a linear kind of time. Makes sense. Again, start with before the beginning, you've got a beginning, you've got 6 days, and then of course on the 7th day, God rested. But if you went on a little bit further in Genesis, you'll remember that there's another thing that happens. The next chapter goes from a kind of wide out to a rather focused look at the creation. In fact, some people say that these are totally different authors. Author 1 wrote one kind of creation, author 2 wrote the second kind of creation. For us, the important thing, I think, is to fast forward a little bit in the creation to what happens to Adam and Eve when they're in Eden, because this gives us yet another way to think about the beginning of time. So there's Adam and Eve, right? They're out there, they're kind of hanging out in Eden. They don't have to work, they don't have to do anything, they can just sort of be there, they can eat some food, they can name some animals, but they don't have to do much, right? And I think this is important because all of the animals and all of the plants around them are reproducing without any kind of death. They're reproducing themselves. And this means, of course, I guess, that Adam and Eve had to have been vegetarians, right? Because there was no death, so there couldn't be any meat, right? But that's an important thing. Just hold on to that idea of death. So anyway, They're hanging out, doing their kind of thing at Eden. They're having a very nice time until, of course, the serpent comes and talks to Eve and says, hey, if you eat that fruit, you're going to know a lot of stuff. She says, oh, I'm not supposed to eat the fruit. He says, yeah, but you're going to know a lot of stuff. She succumbs, she eats the fruit, right? She then takes the fruit and she gives it to Adam. Adam, being a guy, says, sure, I can eat, right? So he takes the fruit from her, he eats the fruit, and bam, they understand good and evil. They understand the problems that might occur outside of Eden. You might want to think, in fact, of Eden as a place outside of time, because things are dying, things aren't changing. But once they've eaten the fruit, according to the Abrahamic tradition, then God gets ticked, right? And God says, I ask you not to do one thing, and you do it anyway. So they eat the fruit, they understand things that probably they shouldn't have understood. And God says, you know what that means? It means that you're going to get booted out of Eden, you're going to have to go live, and you're going to go outside or east of Eden, where you will work, and how does he say it? In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and to dust you shall return. So for us, thinking about time, this offers us yet another beginning, right? Because up to this point, things weren't really changing. Remember, Aristotle talked about time being the before and the after of change. One could argue that inside of Eden, time existed in some way that we don't really get, because they were in there and there's stuff going on, but nothing was changing. Nobody was ever going to die. But outside of Eden, when they get booted out, then we know that death happens, the change happens. So that's another way to think about the beginning of time, not necessarily in the beginning, but now when death happens, when change is introduced into the system. So that's pretty wild, right? Because it changes the way we think about the beginning of time. It could be a beginning of time based on the very beginning. It could be maybe day 4, when the sun and the moon and the stars start, right? Because how would we know that there was a day and what was day and night and what the day and the night were until we had the sun and the moon and the stars? So you might say day 4 is actually the beginning. Maybe you'd say day 6 is the beginning, because that's when humans came onto the scene. Remember, Aristotle told us that in order to have time, you have to have a before and an after and someone to count it. But wait, day 6 wouldn't work when you think about it that way, because there was no change. They were just living there happily without any death, without any change, with the lion and the lamb living together without any problems happening. So in that case, then you might want to say, oh, human time in the Abrahamic tradition is a line that begins maybe, right? Time as we understand it begins maybe actually when Adam and Eve are booted out of paradise, because then things change. Then they have to work, then they have to sweat, then their muscles will get bigger, then Eve will have to have babies and will suffer because of that, and ultimately they will die. So at that point, we have everything that we need in order to have time. We have change, we have people who are changing, and we have the understanding that that's the case. That brings up a really great idea for me in terms of history. Oftentimes, when you're giving some sort of a talk, someone will say, well, what is history? How do you define history? And I always say that history is very simply defined as change over time. Very easy. History is simply the change over time. But when you think about that in a kind of arithmetic way, you can think of history as being change, maybe delta, over time, t. When you think about that in terms of arithmetic, or in terms of, maybe something a little bit more than arithmetic, in order to have history, you have to have change be a numerical value. It has to happen. You have to have time be a numerical value. So in order to have history, you have to have both change and time. If you get rid of change, no history. You get rid of time, no history. You have to have both change and time. Likewise, it kind of assumes, doesn't it, that time happens within change and that history happens within change. So one of the great gifts that I think we have from the Genesis story is twofold. One, Again, this idea of a linear time. It starts at one place. When? Who knows? Might be day 1, might be day 4, might be when they get booted out. But it starts somewhere. And then the second piece of it is that history, human history, happens when we introduce time into the system. If you go back and think about Plato and Aristotle, that makes sense, right? Because we are stuck then inside of time. So time is a different thing. We live in time, but we live in time from the Abrahamic tradition because we are living outside of paradise. Paradise, after all, is the place where things don't change and the place where God resides.